So, you've been assigned a research project that requires you to utilize both primary and secondary sources. Perhaps you're not really sure where to find primary sources, or what's even considered a primary source. To add to the confusion, you hear that whether a source is considered primary or secondary depends on what you're researching. Typically, the difference between a primary and secondary source comes down to this. Primary sources give you first-hand knowledge of an event, a person, or original research. A primary source hasn't been analyzed or interpreted by others. Secondary sources, on the other hand, analyze and discuss primary sources. Some examples of primary sources include newspaper articles printed during the time period you're studying, recordings of speeches, government documents like committee reports and bills, scholarly journal articles reporting the results of original research, and diaries or autobiographies written by someone who experienced the event you're studying. Secondary sources include encyclopedias, magazine and newspaper articles written after the event you're studying, books and textbooks, and literature review articles. Let's start with a simple example. You are researching the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Primary sources would include the law itself as well as earlier drafts, speeches given by civil rights activists, video documentary footage of civil rights demonstrations, and newspaper articles from the time period. Secondary sources include books about the civil rights movement, biographies of various civil rights activists, research articles on the history of the Voting Rights Act, and modern newspaper articles commemorating the act. So far, we've introduced you to general guidelines for understanding primary and secondary resources, but in more complex situations, you must take your research question into account. Let's say you're writing a research paper on Darwin's theory of evolution. In that case, the book, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, would be considered a primary source as it explains Darwin's theory in his own words, with no outside interpretation. Articles such as Bradford Harris's Evolution's Other Narrative discuss, interpret, and comment on Darwin's theories. So, even though Harris's article provides some information on Darwin's theory, it would be considered secondary since it's interpreting and analyzing his work. But let's say your research topic wasn't Darwin's theory. Instead, you are actually researching the various interpretations and criticisms of Darwin's theory over the last 5 years. Instead of using Darwin's book as a primary source, you're now seeking to analyze the various recent interpretations and criticisms of the theory of evolution. In this case, any work that interprets Darwin's theory in recent years, including Harris's article, would be considered primary. Now that you know how to identify primary sources and secondary sources, you might be wondering how to go about locating a primary source. You can search for primary sources directly using keywords or source types, but often one of the best ways to locate primary sources is to look at the footnotes and bibliographies of secondary sources, both articles and books, on your subject. A well-written scholarly article or book is likely to refer to primary sources used by the author. As you approach papers and projects that require you to understand the roles of primary and secondary sources, don't worry if you're a little confused. Remember that your professor or librarian can help at any point in the research process.